Oklahoma is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. That was very gracious indeed, and I appreciate the time. I appreciate the fulsome praise. I do want to just talk a little bit about process, because I think if you're not on the Appropriations Committee, you probably haven't been able to follow a lot of this. And frankly, this process can be made better. There's no doubt about it. I suspect process-wise, my friend from Massachusetts and I are not very far apart on where we think it ought to end up. But I do want the full body to understand what we went through to get to this point. First, it's important to remember that all 12 subcommittees of the Appropriations Committee produced legislation last year. It was there were full hearings, fulsome debate. Each subcommittee reported out their product. Then the full committee dealt with each subcommittee's report and presentation. And in doing so, all amendments were open from both parties. And eventually, of course, all those 12 were put into a single bill. There were hundreds of amendments from both sides of the aisle that were made in order in that process. That bill was brought to the House floor in mid-September, and it was passed. So the House effectively did all of its work. It did the hearings, it did the markups, it reported it to the floor, it moved it across the floor. And we've been waiting for about 180 days for the Senate to respond. The Senate, I can point some fingers, I'm not gonna. Let's just say they didn't get a single appropriations bill across the floor, and only a few out of the full committee. We finally, about 4 weeks ago, had a bipartisan negotiation at the leadership level that reset the numbers. Big increase from the Budget Control Act for defense spending. That's something Republicans very much wanted, and many Democrats did as well. And frankly, also an increase from non-defense discretionary spending as well. So new numbers. At that point, we began what's a pretty normal appropriations process at the committee level. That is the so-called four-corner prospect, when the ranking member of each subcommittee and the chairman of that committee sit down with their Senate counterparts and negotiate the differences between what were effectively Senate committee bills, but bills that the House had moved fully across the floor. And there's a great deal of give and take in that. And when you go as far as you can at the subcommittee level, you kick them upstairs to the chairman at the next level, and they negotiate, and they solve those. I can just give you an example. In Labor H, we had 12 issues unresolved in a $170 billion bill. That's actually awfully good. They were moved up the full committee. 9 of those issues were resolved there. Eventually, 3 more were kicked up to the leadership level, and they were all resolved there. That happens for each and every subcommittee. So there's a great deal of give and take. And frankly, we begin this process knowing it needs to be a bipartisan product in the end. You have to have 60 votes in the United States Senate. There's 51 Republicans. And frankly, over here, obviously, they'll take both Republican and Democratic votes. So there's a good deal of give and take in this particular process. At the end of the day, we've got a bipartisan bill that both the chairman and the ranking member brought before us last night. Again, as I mentioned earlier, from a Republican standpoint, you're probably most pleased with the defense number. That's something we've wanted and the administration wanted. But in the non-defense area, there's many, many things that both sides agree on are very important for the national well-being. A $3 billion increase at the National Institute of Health, largest increase in a generation. Substantially more money on opioids, a crisis we know affects all of our districts. $3 billion this year, $3 billion next year, spread over a number of subcommittee jurisdictions. A substantial increase in early childhood education and child care, something, again, that people on both sides of the aisle feel strongly about. Lots of money for mental health to follow up on some of the initiatives that were laid out in the 21st Century Cures Act. Again, a bipartisan product. Now you're seeing a bipartisan appropriation to try and match the money with the legislation that was created by Energy and Commerce. Money for school safety, probably the largest single increase we've had. I think last year under Title IV we did about $400 million. This bill has $1.1 billion, pretty substantial increase in something that I think we all care about. So again, it's been pretty extraordinary. I also want to point out, and we're all proud of our respective committees, that Chairman Frelinghuysen and Ranking Member Loy produced an omnibus last year in April or May. They've done 3 supplementals for the disaster relief. They now have produced this omnibus, which will fund the government for fiscal year 18. They're hard at work on the next one. So they've been extraordinarily productive. My friend is right. I wish more of this work got piecemeal to the floor, and so we could look at each bill. Hopefully we can do that going forward, since we now have a top-line agreement between the two sides for fiscal year 19 as to what the bill will be. Can I have another minute, Mr. Chairman, or so?
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to give the gentleman 2 additional minutes.
The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for an additional 2 minutes.
I thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, we have the possibility of having a more regular measure, but whether that can be achieved or not, I don't know. But we've at least laid the groundwork for it in passing this bill. But I particularly want to single out Chairman Frelinghuysen and Ranking Member Lowy, because they've shown how Congress can work together. They've managed all 12 of these bills, multiple bills in multiple areas, gotten them to the floor and gotten them across the floor in a bipartisan manner. So if we can do the same thing in the body as a whole, I think there would be much more appreciation and understanding, and frankly much more input, and that would be a good thing. My friend is right about that. But if we're going to do that, I would also add that we have to think through how many amendments, how much floor time do you want to give us? Because if you're going to come down here with 200 or 300 amendments on each side of the aisle, I guarantee you all you'll be doing is appropriations for the whole year. As appropriators, we might like that. As legislators in other areas, you might not. So I think there's got to be some leadership give and take on what the appropriate structure is going forward. But none of that should take away, number one, the rule itself is bringing to the floor an extraordinarily important product. If we don't get that product passed here on a bipartisan basis and in the Senate on a bipartisan basis by midnight tomorrow night, both parties will have participated in shutting down the government of the United States. I don't think that's something either of us want to do. Matter of fact, each of us has tried it, and we now know it's not a very productive way to proceed. So I think we've got an opportunity by passing the rule, and I urge the passage of the rule, and then the underlying legislation to do some really good things for the American people, to fulfill our obligations, and to show that we can govern. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I again want to thank the chairman for his generosity in terms of